Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. On Blessed Man Meditations, we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them. Today we continue looking at Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Metaxas is a best-selling author. He's written books that have been translated into 25 languages. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio show, the Eric Metaxas Radio Show, and the acclaimed conversation series Socrates in the City. He's a prominent cultural commentator and has written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. In the Wall Street Journal, some time ago, he published an article on the scientific evidence for God, namely the fine-tuning. We continue our look at the archaeology portion of his book, Is Atheism Dead? And we look at the discovery of of the Chaldees today. There is a picture of of the Chaldees. It seems certain that one of the main reasons some regard the Bible as a book of folk tales has to do with the wide circulation of its very earliest stories. You have Adam and Eve in the garden, you have Cain and Abel, you have the flood of Noah, and you have the Tower of Babel. Of course, these are the stories most children hear about in Sunday school. But if the Standard Bible runs to about 1,235 pages, these earliest stories make up only something like the first 9. So it doesn't make sense that these very oldest stories, by sheer dint of their great antiquity, would be communicated in a dramatic and poetic way that seems foreign to us. So doesn't it make sense that these very oldest stories would be communicated in a dramatic and poetic way that seems foreign to us? Who would expect them to come to us in a deadeningly dull style of facts? Only textbook. They're going to try to communicate them in a way that seems more interesting. Nonetheless, when many atheists argue against the Bible, they often pick something from one of those 9 pages. The stories of Adam and Eve, the stories of the flood, the Tower of Babel. Or even more typically from the first 3, figuring that sneering at the cartoonish idea of a talking snake would settle the whole matter. They think that the idea that Satan would take the form of a serpent, that's most laughable and enough to dismiss the whole thing. Of course, this is not to say that what is found beyond those first 9 pages is self-explanatory or presents no difficulties. No, the Bible does contain stories that present difficulties. And many of these difficulties are, they should be addressed by Christians. And the objections that are brought need to be carefully thought about and thoughtfully responded to. But it does seem that mocking a talking snake in what is obviously a poetic retelling of an impossibly ancient and powerful story from a time before time as we know it, looks like someone is simply taking cheap shots for fear of having an actual debate. Might not some atheists set their own standards a bit higher and continue looking at the 10th and subsequent pages of the book with equal scrutiny? Yeah, if you're gonna criticize how it begins, why not look at the rest of it? Some of them do, and some of them have, and some of them have asked some really good questions. And there are some very hard questions that people ask of Christians, and not very many Christians are good at thinking about these things. And I've had to think hard about some of these things too. It's certainly not the case that there's nothing to mock after the 9th page. For example, already on page 10 of most Bibles, in Genesis 12, God speaks aloud to Abraham and tells him to leave his country. And if that's not odd enough, before you know it, Abraham is bargaining with God, after which God rains sulfurous hellfire down on Sodom and Gomorrah anyway. Yeah. He says, God, will you spare Sodom and Gomorrah if there's just a handful of righteous people in it? And he says he will, but there are no such righteous people, so he doesn't spare Sodom and Gomorrah. So there are plenty of seemingly preposterous events to make fun of, but the further past page 9 one wanders, the more there is to talk about, which may perhaps seem risky for anyone less interested in actually considering the situation than in holding their preconceived notions so tightly as to suggest someone clutching a purse in an iffy part of town. Now we're going to look at Abraham and the city of Ur. In any event, it is around page 10 or so that the biblical narrative introduces the reader to Abram, later Abraham, who left Ur the Chaldees to go to a place God promised to show him, which one eventually sees as the land of Canaan. Of course, that's the place Abraham's Jewish descendants have called their home for the better part of 4 millennia. For many, however, the stories of Abraham's divinely inspired wanderings seem little better than what might be called the founding myth of the Jews, meaning that it's just a colorful story, much as Rome's founding myth is colorful, featuring abandoned twins named Romulus and Remus, who find nourishment at the swollen teats of a kindly she-wolf in a cave. Everyone understands that's not something that actually took place, the Romulus and Remus story. But just as we logically dismiss Lupine adoption, mustn't we also dismiss the idea of a man led by God through the ancient desert with his vast flocks and family, if only because it hails from 1,000 years before the tale of the suckling siblings and their hirsute wet nurse? So if we're going to dismiss the Romulus and Remus story, then by virtue of the fact that it's so old, shouldn't we also dismiss the Abraham story? So we might expect from the beginning of the 19th century, when such things began to be questioned, the stories of Abraham, and indeed the very existence of Ur the Chaldees, were read with skepticism. Right, if we're going to dismiss the story of Abraham, we can just take it a step further and dismiss that a place like Ur the Chaldees even exists. But as we've seen, what was initially so easily dismissed was often later not so easily dismissed after all. Right, Metaxas is shown in chapter after chapter with the archaeological discoveries that have been found. Even before that, the scientific stuff that's been discovered and studied, that these things can't just be swept under the rug. For example, from at least the 17th century onward, a number of European travelers to the part of the world in which Abraham is supposed to have wandered would return with stories of having glimpsed the ancient remains of a vast ziggurat, standing alone in the middle of the blasted wasteland and nothingness of the desert. Whatever it had been and whoever had built it, no one knew, but these stories over time continued to return with travelers. Then, in 1849, William Kennett Loftus, pictured above, found the site they had mentioned and published a description of the ziggurat. He even found some bricks there, at Tel El Makayar, just south of the Euphrates River in what's today southeastern Iran, and forwarded them to London to Sir Henry Rawlinson. We read about Rawlinson in one of the previous chapters. Rawlinson examined the bricks and quickly reckoned the site worthy of further excavation. So J.P. Taylor, British Vice Consul of Basra, began excavations at the site in 1853. After he'd found a number of inscribed clay cylinders and bricks, he confidently identified the site as the fabled Ur of the Chaldees, home of the great patriarch Abraham. And so another fabled world from the ancient scriptures was pulled from the sand and into the present. The great site was not thoroughly excavated until 1927, but we know now that this city not only existed at the time of Abraham, but had already been thriving for 2,000 years, having been a major city since 3800 BC. And evidence of human settlement there stretches back even further to the 7th millennium BC. At the time of Abraham, Ur was the largest city in the world with a population of 65,000. In Genesis, we read that Abraham's father, Terah, took Abraham and his daughter-in-law, Sarah, and grandson Lot out of Ur. They traveled toward Canaan and settled in Haran. Loftus, who discovered and identified Ur, may also be credited with identifying the city of Shushan, or Susa, which is identified in the Bible as the Persian city where the events of the book of Esther took place. Shushan is also mentioned in the books of Nehemiah and Daniel. Rawlinson first visited this site in 1836. A. H. Layard visited it some years later, but in 1851 Loftus made some excavation there and soon identified it as none other than Shushan from the biblical texts. The city's discovery, however, is overshadowed by an object uncovered there that ranks among the most significant archaeological discoveries in history, and that further corroborates details from the earliest pages of the Bible. Now we're going to look at Gustave Jequier and Hammurabi's Code. In 1901, the Swiss Egyptologist Gustave Jequier had the honor of finding it, an 8-foot-tall stele made of black basalts covered over nearly every inch with cuneiform writing and crowned with a bas-relief image of a king receiving a law from a god. Once deciphered from the old Akkadian, it was discovered to be a list of 282 laws, which we now know as the famous Hammurabi Code, an unprecedented list of laws laid down by the eponymous Babylonian king. The stele likely stood in Babylon for 6 centuries, but in the 12th century BC was taken as plunder by the Elamites, who hauled it back to Susa, where it lay buried until the 20th century. The code would have far-reaching historical significance, being ahead of its time in many ways. The preface read, quote, "The god of the sky called me by name, Hammurabi, the exalted prince, who feared God to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak," end quote. But what makes it a uniquely valuable find for those wondering whether the Bible is historically accurate is that this stele presents detailed information about life in that part of the world from the 18th century BC. In so doing, it further confirms many practices and other specifics from the earliest pages of Genesis. For example, Genesis tells us that regarding inheritance, Abraham's eldest son Ishmael, whom he fathered with the slave Hagar, was nonetheless reckoned to be ranked below his younger brother Isaac, whom Abraham fathered with his wife Sarah. Sure enough, Hammurabi's code tells us regarding inheritance that the status of the son of the first wife is above that of the son of a slave, even if the son of the slave was born before the son of the first wife. Later on, in Genesis 37:28, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers for the sum of 20 shekels. Hammurabi's code puts the price of the slave at 20 shekels. Because of this single object discovered in 1901, it becomes impossible to believe that Genesis could have been composed many centuries earlier, or over 1,000 years later, as some Bible skeptics have been claiming. After all, how could someone know the cost of a slave from a millennium before their time? In his book Unearthing the Bible, the archaeologist Titus Kennedy explains that the earlier ancient codes set the price lower. For example, the law code of Ur-Nammu from 2050 BC set the price of 10 shekels, and the laws of Eshuna from 1930 BC set the price of 15 shekels. The price rose to 30 shekels at Ugarit in the 14th century BC and to 50 in Assyria during the 8th century BC. We see that what the Bible tells us is a remarkable, accurate figure at the time of the patriarchs. Kennedy also tells us that a trove of tablets found in the ancient Mesopotamian city of Nuzi, first discovered in 1896, similarly refers to many social and cultural customs we find in the patriarchal narratives in Genesis, and are also narrowly particular to that part of the world at that time. I believe I have recently done, there's going to be a chapter on this channel from Josh McDowell's The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, in which he goes into the several of the archaeological discoveries that relate to the Old Testament, and there's quite a bit on the Nuzi tablets in one of the chapters in that book. It's a curious trend that the more we seem to discover, the more the Bible emerges as an accurate historical record of the events, people, and places it depicts, so that what we once were able to write off as myths and fairy tales we cannot help but fairly observe to be an accurate account of the events, people, and places it depicts. And sometimes it's the specificity and accuracy of certain details that's most impressive. Now we're going to look at the King Jehoiakim window balustrade. That's where that picture comes from. On the bottom there is the path. And it's cited in Jeremiah chapter 22. Even by the most notably deplorable standards of many of the kings of Judah and Israel, Jehoiakim stands out as a skunk of the first order. He lived in incestuous relationships with his mother, his stepmother, and daughter-in-law, and essentially had everyone he disliked murdered. Scoundrel, huh? He was also responsible for sending the prophet Daniel to Babylon in order to appease King Nebuchadnezzar and brutally tax the people of Jerusalem while he lived in high style. In her book, Etched in Stone, Lisette Bassett Brody explains that in condemning Jehoiakim, the prophet Jeremiah specifically mentioned the especially lavish palace he built for himself. Here is the quote from Jeremiah chapter 22. "Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his chambers by injustice, who uses his neighbor's service without wages and gives him nothing for his work, who says, I will build myself a white house with spacious chambers and cut out windows for it, paling it with cedar and painting it with vermilion." We hardly expect archaeology to corroborate paint colors from the 7th century BC, but when a palace was discovered in 1959, halfway between Bethlehem and the old city of Jerusalem, it was identified as the one built by Jehoiakim, for it stood inside the fortress he'd also built, just as the scriptures had said. So we discovered this. So archaeologists discovered this palace in 1959, and this palace that they discovered, they find is the palace that was built by Jehoiakim. That's described in the scriptures. The palace matched Jeremiah's description in even the astonishing detail of windows with vermilion painted cedar. Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs explains, quote, window balustrades consisting of a row of stone colonnettes decorated with palmettes and topped with jointed capitals in the proto-Aeolic style were also found. They probably adorned the upper story of the buildings inside the citadel. These decorative architectural elements echo a verse in the book of Jeremiah, which describes the windows in the house of King Jehoiakim of Judah, and cut out windows for it, paneling it with cedar, painting it with vermilion. Such a level of accuracy underscores the trustworthiness of the biblical accounts. The Bible also says that Jeremiah prophesied that Jehoiakim would be given a burial of a donkey and dragged and dumped beyond the gates of Jerusalem. This prophecy was fulfilled. The fulfillment of this ignominious prophecy is confirmed in the writings of the first century historian Josephus, who tells us that King Nebuchadnezzar installed Jehoiakim's son as his vassal, and during the excavation of the palace, a seal was discovered bearing the name Eliakim, whom the Bible mentions as an official to his son. There is that seal. So we find a seal that is used by one of the characters in the Bible. Official seal. Once again, the smallest and most specific details from the Bible continued to be confirmed. Of course, it's one thing to discover the palace of a king from 6 or so centuries before the time of Christ, and it's another to speak that a world of 1,000 years, to speak the world that. Of course, it's one thing to discover the palace of a king from 6 or so centuries before the time of Christ, and it's another to speak of that world 1,000 years earlier, and even several centuries before the Greek fleet sailed for Troy, making famous the exploits of Achilles and Hector and Odysseus. As we've seen with the discovery of Abraham's Ur of the Chaldees, perhaps the biblical account of that most distant era is not entirely mythical after all. But far more mythical sounding than the mere existence of a great city are the events that are supposed to have happened not long after Abraham's journey out of Ur, when he and his nephew visited the fabled cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Bible says these cities of the plain were destroyed with the divine fire of judgment, and so very completely and decisively that the mere mention of these places would for many centuries hence fill the people with deepest dread and horror. Can there be anything to such a tale? And even if there could we ever know about it? Well, next time we'll find out, where we look in chapter 18 at the discovery of the biblical Sodom. So thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.